My number 7 best chess game of the 1990s is John Nunn versus Igor Alexander Nataf from the French Team Championship. This gem from 1999 sees the black player sacrifice a full rook to catch the white king in the middle of the board and create an amazing attack on the dark squares. I've enjoyed this game every single time I've seen it, but getting to analyze it again for this video, I was particularly dazzled by some of the amazing checkmates that were even left behind the scenes. Nunn begins the game with pawn to e4, and Nataf responds with c5, a Sicilian defense. We're going to get into a Kalashnikov variation of the Sicilian defense after we get the early e5 push from Nataf. The difference between the Kalashnikov and the Sveshnikov is in the fact that knight f6 and knight c3 have not yet been included, so this pawn is unblocked. As a result, after knight b5, going after d6, and the immediate d6 to prevent the knight from sinking its hooves into that square, you can now play pawn to c4. Again, this is the result of the omission of knight f6 and knight c3. This is a double-edged move that does cede some control over d4 for extra control and space around the d5 square. As a result, it scored a little better for white than other lines in the Sveshnikov, but it is definitely playable for both sides. After here, pawn to c4, we see bishop e7, knight 1 to c3, a6, and the knight is pushed back to a3. The knight is obviously not very happy to be on the a3 square. Of course, there is a risk that it will take too much time for the knight to get reintroduced into the play. In this game, as you might suspect, the knight is not going to manage to get back into the game. Black in this case picks the most aggressive option, pawn to f5, striking at the middle of the board. Now here, a safe option for white is to capture that pawn, securing some pressure due to control of the light squares in the middle of the board. Instead, Nunn decides on the move bishop to d3, putting pressure on the pawn and developing a piece. Now, in response, we see pawn to f4 from Nataf. This is a committal move. It does restrict, for example, this bishop and gain space on the king side, so if black can get away with it, black will be very happy to have included this expansive move. Now, to meet this, white must play pawn to g3, trying to chip away at that pawn on f4, remove it from the board, and take away that spatial advantage on the king side that black has just tried to establish. After g3, because you definitely don't want to capture over here and create a situation where this rook is gaining open lines and the structure is perfect and you've lost all of your space, it makes sense to sacrifice the pawn. That's what happens after g3. We get knight to f6 in this position. This is a very interesting pawn sacrifice. It's a little bit hard to believe that after pawn takes, captures, bishop takes, and castles, black has full compensation for the pawn. After all, black doesn't even have a lead in development. Really, I guess you can say black is castled and white is not. That's definitely going to be a big factor in the game, but it seems like this should be a pretty speculative sacrifice. In fact, though, this seems to be a completely sound sacrifice, largely based on the fact that black is getting really good control over the dark squares in a lot of the key lines. I would encourage you to pay attention as we go through this game to how many times the white king is going to get checkmated in critical lines on dark squares that white has no control over. Now, that's a result of specific lines of play, but the weakness on the dark squares is already manifest, and it's something that you should be paying attention to. It seems subtle, but it does matter. After castles, we see bishop g3 here, preemptively retreating that loose bishop that was very vulnerable to discoveries as the knight might have moved, and knight to g4, taking eye at these squares over here, and also thinking maybe I would fall back to e5 under the right circumstances. Now, in this position, we actually see a mistake. Let's look first at what white should have done. That is the move pawn to f4. This is a very committal move. It's hard to want to play a move that's going to continue to expand with pawns at the cost of development, still leaving the king uncastled and creating all sorts of soft spots in your position. But this was the right way to play, and it reduces the pressure that black has on the f-file. Now, black can continue in a very enterprising way in this line as well, and I really love the following line. Bishop h4, trying to chip away at the control of this square. This introduces two threats based on the pin on this bishop. That is, knight takes h2, one threat, and rook takes f4. There's also ideas of knight to e3. So the move that defends all of these threats is queen to d2, defending each of the squares that I just mentioned. Now, a very interesting and seemingly quite sound sacrifice for black is knight c to e5. This is incredibly audacious. Now, you don't have to accept this knight sacrifice, and you probably shouldn't. For example, you can castle here, but you do have to respond in some way. There are threats here like knight f3 check. If you accept the knight sacrifice, fe5 here, then bishop g5 is going to be a move that's going to pin your king in the middle of the board. If you play queen e2, which is the best queen move because otherwise knight e3 and bishop g4 happens against most other queen moves, black can play knight back to e5. In this position, it's not possible for white to castle in either direction, and as a result, facing ideas like bishop g4, we actually have good compensation with the black pieces. Now, you really should eliminate that knight. Bishop takes e5, pawn takes e5, but that's going to concede control of the dark squares. Here's one really critical line that I love. Rook f1 makes total sense to try and trade rooks. A trade here, bishop h3 check, pushing the king over to g1. And how can black continue the attack here and introduce the queen? There's only one move that gives compensation, but it does give compensation, and it is a banger of a move. Bishop c1. I love this move so much. It cuts off the rook, it eyes potentially b2, and most importantly, it frees the g5 square for the queen. Now you cannot capture because of rook takes and queen g5, picking off the rook with a winning position, but other lines are also difficult. Black has at least enough compensation here after this move. Bishop to c1, amazing move. I love this whole line. Now, backing up, that was really sharp and exciting, but it was still the best thing available for white. Instead of pawn to f4, we saw bishop e2. And I was really surprised to read Nunn commenting on this game and say that he didn't really consider that the knight could choose not to retreat here. And I say that only because he's playing a strong grandmaster, and of course retreating the knight I think is just conceding that you don't have compensation for your pawn here. So although the next move is spectacular and brilliant, I do think that Nunn should have considered it, as it's the only logical follow-up to knight g4. And that is knight takes f2. Boom! This is an incredible move. Again, black does not really have a tangible lead in development, but this move is going to capture the king in the middle of the board, and the black pieces are going to be able to create a sufficient attack to bring down this king. Now, in this position, you should throw in the move queen to d5 check so that the queen can control the g5 square and make it harder for black to bring the queen in critical lines. If you capture on f2 right away instead of throwing in a check on d5, then rook takes f2. You must follow up with this sacrifice as well, another boom move. If queen d5 check, the rook can fall back, so it's too late to throw in queen d5 check. Rook takes f2, king takes f2, bishop to h4 check, and after the king tries to run, there's lots of ways it can try to run, but the main point is we're getting to g5, again, because this queen is not here, and if king d3, I really like knight b4 check, perfect, everything comes together. The king cannot get away to c2, so he's forced up to d4, and you actually have your pick of checkmates in one. That is both bishop to f2 checkmate and queen to c5 checkmate. Both lovely, lovely checkmates. Again, concluding this attack that largely proceeds on the dark squares where white has no defense. So, after knight takes f2, we do see white accurately play the inclusion queen to d5 check in this line. The king runs over, and now bishop takes f2. In fact, rook f1 was a very sensible way to try to decline the sacrifice and might have held the balance for white. After bishop takes f2 here, knight b4, actually it might have made sense to sacrifice on f2 first, but that's a small finesse here. And that's because in this position, queen d4 might have been a better defense than what white played, although black would still have an advantage after rook takes f2 in this line as well. The lines are very similar to the lines we're going to see. I'll just point out that the unique move that is available here, queen takes, doesn't keep the king any safer because the queen is just going to get pinned to the king, so black is winning here as well. After knight b4, the queen does go over to h5, and from here on, it's a total win by force. Queen h5, rook takes f2, now king takes f2, bishop h4 check. In this position, there's a lot of squares the king can run to, but none will escape. If king e3 here, g6. This is a critical move. The queen is not able to maintain her very strong defensive position where she's stopping this queen from going to g5. If she goes up here, there's always going to be bishop g5 check. Now in this case, it's a fork, but even if it wasn't a fork, the queen would be trapped. So that's a critical idea and line. After pawn g6, queen f3. Here the queen can introduce herself on g5, a very cruel introduction. If queen to f4 in this position, then we have queen c5. The queen is doubling over, king back, and bishop g5, and we have pinned the queen right here. We win the queen, and we win the game. Some other lines. After queen c5 check, if the king goes to f3, there's queen to f2 and checkmate. This bishop on c8, seemingly not playing a role, actually does help out. It covers the g4 square. So after bishop h4 check, we have some other lines to consider here. Now my favorite, my absolute favorite, king f3. The lines here are the most beautiful. Queen f6 check, and the king tries to run to e3 in this position. There are, in fact, multiple winning moves. But the best move, the move that forces checkmate in 3, is queen to d4 check. Boom! This is so, so beautiful. The queen is sacrificed on an empty square to try to lure the king into this checkmate right here. What a finish to the game that would have been. A beautiful and incredibly picturesque position. Now, after queen d4 check, this amazing queen sacrifice does not have to be accepted, but it leads to mate no matter what. If king f4, queen check, and you can block on f3 in two different ways leading to different mates. The queen can block, and then you have pawn to g5 and checkmate. And you also have a second mate, actually. After bishop f3 here, you have two mates. You have both knight d3 mate and queen to d2 mate. It's amazing how black is spoiled for choice here. Hunting down this king, there is beautiful mate after beautiful mate. It doesn't seem like you can even find a way to pick an unattractive checkmate here. Finally, after bishop h4 check, I should mention king g1. This actually transposes to the game, so we're going to just move on quickly to the game continuation, which is after bishop h4 check, king g2. Now after king g2, once again, we should chase the queen away, pawn g6, and as I mentioned a little bit earlier, queen h6, bishop g5 is a trapped queen, so the queen must fall back. She pulls back queen f3. And in this position, Queen g5 check. We've pushed the queen back. We've made the square available for our queen. The king goes to f1. And another striking move, bishop to h3 check. Boom, again. This is a clearance sacrifice to include the final heavy piece, the rook on a8, in the attack, and this is completely decisive. Queen takes h3, the rook comes in, rook to f8 check, bishop to f3 to block that check, and queen to e3. Now, the bishop on f3 is falling, but that does not immediately mean that the game is over. There's still a finesse here. Notice, of course, that trying to defend the bishop with the king would simply allow queen to f2 here. A nice mate, I think it would be considered an epaulette mate, where the queen and the rook are sitting on top of the king's shoulders right here. So, after queen to e3, we get queen takes h4, and here is a really important moment. This is a great moment to pause the video and find the only winning move. Well, the winning move is not to capture on f3 with either the rook or the queen. This just leads to a perpetual here where the king is pushed back and forth between g2 and g1. Only a draw. We want more than that. And actually, rook takes f3 is even worse. This one actually allows white to win because after king g2, there's no way to continue the attack and check this king that will also leave the rook defended. Therefore, white will be able to play this next move and end the black attack. In fact, the only winning move is the quiet move, knight to d3, introducing the knight into an attack on f2 and preparing to capture on the next turn. After knight d3, there's simply no defense here for white. Knight d5 is played. Queen takes f3. Actually, rook takes f3 is a little bit faster. I'll show that. It begins with king g2, queen check, and after the king falls back, this queen is covering the critical squares, so pawn to g5 would force mate in at most four more moves. Instead, though, queen takes f3 is played, which is also winning and very beautiful. The king goes over to g1 and knight to f2. This rook on h1 is trapped, but not only will the rook go, to escape mate, you must also concede this rook. So both rooks are falling in the next couple of moves. That's exactly what happened. King f1, queen takes h1, king up, queen takes a1. And in this position, having just lost both rooks, no longer having a material advantage, and continuing to not have a safe king, white decided to resign the game. I hope that you've enjoyed this amazing attacking game, and particularly the move queen to d4 check leading to bishop f2 checkmate. Mwah! That's my favorite moment in the game. If you like this game and want to see more of my top games from the 1990s or the 2000s, then simply click on the playlist that is sitting right on top of the screen.